This is Office Hours at Duke University. I'm James Todd from Duke's News Office. Today's conversation is with Professor David Schanzer. He'll be talking about anti-terrorism efforts and Muslim Americans. You can participate in this conversation as well. To do that, send an email to live@duke.edu or tweet with the tag Duke Live or post a comment on the Duke University Facebook page. Professor Schanzer, we're here at your office hours, so let's just hit a few highlights about you. You direct the Triangle Center on Terrorism and Homeland Security at Duke, the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill, and RTI International jointly. You're a professor at Duke's Sanford School of Public Policy, and this week you and your colleagues published this report, Anti-Terror Lessons of Muslim Americans. And probably most importantly, we should say today is your birthday.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Yes, well, happy birthday. And so I imagine you've been a busy man over the last 2 weeks. You studied terrorism. We had this Christmas Day attempted bombing of the Northwest Airlines flight, and there's been a reaction up to it up through yesterday with the Obama administration releasing their review and their response. So how do you frame this up when you're talking with reporters, with colleagues, with friends and family? What's the frame that you put on it?
Well, it is concerning because 2 years ago, if you look at where things were, Al-Qaeda in Iraq had essentially been defeated, or at least very strongly set back by the combination of the surge and other tactics that were deployed that really hit them very hard. Obviously, they had lost their safe haven in Afghanistan. And most importantly, ideologically, there were a lot of fundamentalist clerics who were actually splitting from the movement and saying that that they were killing too many people and weren't advancing their cause. So it seemed like there were very extreme fissures. And matter of fact, some experts were predicting that this was the beginning of the end of Al-Qaeda. And what we've seen with the Christmas Day bomber was their ability to try to project an attack from abroad into the United States. And something else that we've seen, which is more reflective of the Fort Hood, is that Al-Qaeda-ism, I'll call it, this radical fundamentalist ideology, violent ideology, has continued to, in a sense, grow and continue to inspire other people to essentially self-radicalize and take violent action on their own, whether it be in the United States or abroad. So these two aspects of the problem have reemerged in the last 2 months, and that is concerning.
And what about the Christmas Day attack, the review that's out just yesterday from the Obama administration and the memo outlining their response? Are the right lessons being drawn from it?
Well, I am encouraged by President Obama's focus on the intelligence aspects of it rather than beefing up screening, although he did say yesterday they were going to spend another $1 billion on screening. We can get into the choices and the relative merits between that. Although I have to say, I've been involved in this really since 2001, and the 9/11 Commission made clear that information sharing, gathering of intelligence, and having interagency and international coordination was really the key to defeating this radical movement that we're up against. And it is disappointing that we're seeing the exact same types of issues crop up again here. I just want to point out one thing from the President's speech yesterday. He mentioned 4 things that he was directing the administration to do. He said, first, I'm directing our intelligence community immediately begin assigning specific responsibility for investigating all leads on high priority threats so these leads are pursued and acted upon aggressively. You have to look at that and say, gosh, I would have thought we had been doing that already. So it seems like this is in some ways deja vu all over again.
I got you. We already have our first question here. It comes by email. It's from Jack, and you mentioned the response and technology versus analysis. And the email says, President Obama directed Homeland Security to spend an installation of $1 billion in advanced technology equipment for the screening of passengers, including body scanners at American airports. Is President Obama guilty of the overreaction that you warned against?
Well, I think so. I think the screening at the checkpoints is one part of a multi-layered defense system that we have that deals with only one aspect of the threat. So we're now going to invest another $1 billion into that. And let's understand that any technology that we put up, Al-Qaeda is already working on ways to circumvent it. We have what we call an adaptive adversary. So either they'll adapt to try to get around that technology, or they'll just shift to some other target or some other means. A matter of fact, if you recall, back in 2006, I believe, there was a great concern about shoulder-launched missiles that could bring down an airliner, especially one abroad, but even here in the United States. And many in Congress were saying, we need to equip every large aircraft with anti-missile technology to defeat that threat. Well, it turned out that that was incredibly expensive, and we decided not to do it. But the threat is still there. It's still the same as it always was. And so who knows, Al-Qaeda might just easily move back to that threat. So to my mind, if you have an extra $1 billion lying around that you want to spend to deal with this problem, I think you get much more counterterrorism bang for the security buck by investing that in preventing these individuals from coming to the United States in the first place. And that means intelligence, watch listing procedures, more staff so there's better coordination with our international allies. After all, you know, the British had put a suspension on the Christmas bombers' visa. Right. Well, we didn't know that, or we either knew it and we didn't take action, or we didn't know it. So there's a lot of room for improvement there. And if you can stop the person from coming, then you've dealt with all of the threats, right? You've dealt with the threat he might pose to aviation, or if he comes in the United States to the subway system, or whatever other havoc that person might cause. If you focus on one narrow part of the threat, you're really only not dealing with the whole problem.
And what about other options? I mean, there's the screening and there's the intelligence analysis, but people also mention military offensives, take the battle to Al-Qaeda, or on the left, food aid, international aid. So what about those options? They don't seem to be front and center.
Well, dealing with this problem has to be a comprehensive approach. You have to be offensive, defensive, and progressive, in a sense, all at the same time. Mm-hmm. And indeed, President Bush, in his initial address in September 20th to Congress, said we're going to use every tool, every element of our national power. Now, unfortunately, he emphasized some aspects much, much more over others, both rhetorically and in terms of investments, which I don't think led us to as much progress as we might have had during his term. But we need to do really all of those things at the same time. But certainly, denying terrorists and terrorist organizations a place where they can plan, plot, and organize with impunity is really the top priority. And so whether that be Somalia, Yemen, the hinterlands of Pakistan on the border with Afghanistan, denying safe havens is really a very, very important part of the strategy. And we can't do that on our own, especially if we're not in conflict with the government. We have to have friends and allies and build up their capabilities, whether it be the Pakistanis or Yemenis, to deal with that problem with our assistance. So that, yes, that's an important prong. Now, you mentioned food aid. I think there is an important role for essentially building better societies and hope for Muslim people around the world as a method for dealing with this conflict. Now, somebody will immediately point out, they'll say, oh, well, Umar Farouk Abdul-Muttalib, he was a wealthy person. He came from a privileged background, yet he still ended up here. So it's not about economics and food aid. And what I would say in response to that is that, yes, that's entirely true. But what we need to do in the Muslim world is to build up really interconnectivity between those parts of the world where we're seeing these problems and the rest of the world. It is globalization is a great thing if it incorporates more countries and more people into our international economy and system. But those who are on the outside of that interconnectivity have grievances. They seem disconnected. They are disaffected from the mainstream of the global society. And those are the conditions that breed the possibility for radicalization. So it's not about providing specific aid to alleviate poverty for the purpose, because impoverished people are the ones who are going on to commit terrorism. It's not about that. What it's about is building stronger societies that are more interconnected and giving people a stake in the success of those societies, which can help to fight radicalization in the long term. But let's understand, that's a very long-term project. So if you want to defend yourself in the short run, you have to do some of the more unsavory things, like, as you said, taking it to the offensive.
I got you, Professor Schanzer. We have 35 people participating in the office hours right now online.
Welcome.
And we've got an email here from Sherry. Everyone else is invited to ask a question of Professor Schanzer. To do that, you send an email to alive@duke.edu, where you tweet with the tag Duke Live or post a comment on the Duke University Facebook page. So to Sherry's question, she writes in by email. You mentioned President Bush and rhetoric, so she picks up there. And wouldn't it be safer for Americans to understand we are actually a target of radicalism by identifying the main culprits as Muslim instead of dancing around the issue? If the discussions are going so well with the Muslim American community, then they would most likely agree that some form of profiling is necessary to keep all of us safe. Correct?
Well, it's true that the greatest threat, especially domestically at the moment, comes from Muslims. But the idea that you can identify even who a Muslim is, this is a religious group, not an ethnic one. Muslims don't walk around with an M on their forehead. Matter of fact, our study, which you're about to show here, demonstrates that of the 139 people that we found who had either committed some terrorist act of violence or was arrested and had charges pending on those offenses, almost equal amounts were white, African American, Somali, South Asian, and Arab, and so they all look and seem different. There's no way we're going to be able to, quote, profile those individuals, and if we focus on one specific ethnicity, we're probably going to miss others. So we should do some profiling in the sense that, as our study shows, we're mostly looking at young men. So I believe, sure, if you're going to put some more emphasis at the screening points or in various activities, you would want to focus on young men rather than old women, let's say. So I'm in favor of that. But we also really need to be looking at behaviors. The Christmas Day bomber left all kinds of other clues about his behavior that should have enabled us to pick up on him. So that's a kind of profiling I'd be more interested in, looking at kind of those broad categories and also at certain behaviors that are kind of clues of possible radicalization.
What about the profiling that's been done now by the administration, this 14 countries where citizens from those countries are singled out for extra scrutiny? What about that?
Boy, I have mixed feelings about that. On the one hand, it in terms of using scarce resources to deal with where the risk really is, it does make sense. Why not, if you're going to use extra resources, why not direct them for the countries that where the problems are coming from? If I were in charge, I would have maybe done that, but not announced it. I mean, let's face it, if you've put the list on the internet and everybody knows, it's really not that hard to get from, let's say, Yemen to some other country in the Middle East, Tanzania, let's say, and then go from Tanzania to Europe and then to the United States. So I wonder if it's really much of a barrier to somebody who's not an amateur, but is planning and has some help thinking about how they're going to execute their plot.
Right, and talking about profiling, we're starting to get into this report that came out just this week that you've co-authored, and your colleagues here, Professor Charles Kurzman, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, Professor Ibrahim Musa here at Duke, Anti-Terror Lessons of Muslim Americans. And you mentioned that number that's at the core of this, 139 Muslim Americans who've attempted acts of terrorism from September 11th to the end of 2009. And the headlines on this report are reading that you're saying that's not that big a number, that it's actually it's overstated.
Well, when you hear most discussions about terrorism in general, and especially we feel about homegrown terrorism, it's all impressionistic. Nobody tries to quantify or put a sense on it. People say, the threat is large, the threat is small, it's growing. Well, how do you know? There's very little data and research. So what we tried to do is to collect these cases as at least some sort of barometer to give us some sense of how large the problem. Listen, if you have a problem where there's 10,000 or 20,000 people who are involved, it's a lot different than if you have something in the hundreds. So I don't want to focus on that 139 number with exact precision as if that's the only people who might be influenced by this radical ideology. It's not. But we use the figure that during the same period that those 139 people were either arrested or committed terrorist activities, there were 136,000 murders in the United States. So we want to just try to give it some balance. And we'll let other people say whether the problem's been exaggerated or the problem's been understated. We'll leave that to others. We're just trying to give us some measurement so we can put this in context and relate it to other social problems that we have. Clearly, we have problems of education, infrastructure, healthcare in this country. Given the scope of the homegrown terrorism problem, and I don't deny that it is a problem, how do we want to allocate our resources? Let's not, go crazy.
Now, the report does note that there's been an uptick of these incidents, homegrown terrorism, in 2009, and of course there was 2 more arrests terrorism-related this morning. So is that concerning? Is there something there that goes against the rest of the report, saying that it's not a major issue?
Well, it's certainly concerning, but we just don't know at this point whether this is kind of an aberration or a trend. Let's look at, of those 41 incidents in 2009, let's look at the 9 individuals from North Carolina who were arrested, it's 9 or 7, and I'm missing my facts here now, in July. That investigation was going on for a number of years. They decided to take these individuals down in 2009 because there was some sense that they might be going to travel abroad. So they brought it down and they filed the indictment. Now that could have easily happened in 2008 or 2010. I don't think it means anything that it necessarily happened this year. Now, if we go another 2 or 3 years and we have that level, which is in the 40s and 50s as opposed to the less than 10, well, I would say then that there's a trend and that we're seeing an increased level of activity. But at this point, I just think it's too early to tell.
Good. We've got another email question. It comes from Andrea, and everyone else who's watching can ask a question of Professor Schanzer. To do that, send an email to live@duke.edu. You can tweet with the tag Duke Live or post a comment on the Duke University Facebook page. Professor Schanzer, Andrea asked, the Fort Hood disaster shattered the public's confidence in the government's ability to detect and act on intelligence. While radical extremists in the U.S. may be few, the impact when they act is huge. What confidence can we have that any measures to control extremism will really work when we can't even detect it and act on it within the armed forces?
Well, there's no doubt that the Fort Hood was a tragedy, and as I said, when we were talking our prior question with the 139, as I said, I'm going to leave it to others to decide whether that's a huge number or a very small one. The whole nature of terrorism is that few incidents can cause a great amount of fear. And that's the whole idea of what the terrorists are trying to do, is to use that fear to actually get us to either change certain policies, which was what they were like, or take steps that make the conflict even worse, which I would argue we've done in some instance, mainly the war in Iraq. But with respect to Fort Hood, again, there were clues all over the place with this individual. We're going to need to have constant vigilance. I think that is key. And what we talk about in our report is that the relationship with Muslim American communities can really help us provide an early warning system. Are Muslim Americans responsible for preventing all acts of domestic terrorism as a community? I would say no. We don't place that responsibility, let's say, on people who are environmentalists, on people who execute eco-terrorism, or anybody who has conservative views on right-wing extremism. We don't place that burden on them. However, it's both in their interest and the national interest for them to be vigilant, to be active, to have good relations with law enforcement, and to provide information when they think that there might be somebody who is going amiss. Now, I think that also means on our side, especially on law enforcement side, that if you want to create that kind of flow of information and that trusting relationship, there needs to be some flexibility and also some demonstration that there are different levels of kinds of interventions. That if the Muslim American community, somebody provides some information on someone, but that person really hasn't made deep connections with the terrorist organization, they've made some mistakes, they've talked to some people that they shouldn't have, maybe that person is, in a sense, salvageable and can be pulled out of away from that ideology and put on a better path. So, we would encourage, and we found examples in our report of instances where law enforcement had done that. So we think it's important to have a full range of different types of interventions that might be taken when a Muslim American community essentially points out a problem. Listen, sometimes somebody's going to need to be thrown in jail. Nobody denies that. But if we want to increase and maximize cooperation and catching people like the Fort Hood shooter before something goes astray, we're going to have those kinds of interactions.
So let's talk about that, because that's a major finding in the report, is that one of the best strategies for counterterrorism domestically is to work with, to collaborate with, join forces with Muslim American communities. So what does that look like, FBI agent and imam? I mean, how do they get together?
Well, since 9/11, FBI has really had a very pronounced campaign to have outreach, develop relationships with religious leaders, and I'd say it's been partially successful. What does it look like? It looks like people who are usually cops on the beat and analysts who were ought to be working on major cases, spending their time breaking bread with community groups, attending open houses at mosques, and really do the things that are about relationship building and not kind of classic law enforcement. And that's going on. There are also programs to expose Muslims, young Muslims who might be interested in going into law enforcement perhaps, about what the FBI and other law enforcement agencies are all about. There are a lot of different forms of outreach. A couple points I want to make which were in our report. We think it's very important, first of all, that we should have outreach that goes not just through law enforcement, but through other types of social service agencies. What we're trying to do is to help better integrate Muslim Americans into the mainstream of American life. We've done that in our history in the United States. We're very good at assimilating immigrants, and indeed, one of the reasons we have less of a problem here than we do, let's say, in Europe, is because we've always assimilated, and Muslim Americans are eager to assimilate. Actually, as immigrants, they come here to pursue the American dream. Unfortunately, most Muslims came to European countries, Germany, UK, France, mostly to serve as a source of cheap labor. And those countries did not try to make them French citizens or German citizens the way we always try to make our immigrants to be Americans first. So those are the types of policies that we need to encourage that are going to incorporate Muslim Americans into the mainstream of American society. Things that distance them, make them feel like the other, if they feel like they're extremely unfairly discriminated against, or the culture, things that they see in the media or television shows are so anti-Muslim that it leads to their children being harassed in school. Those are the types of things that are going to distance people, make them feel socially isolated, and those are the conditions that can lead to radicalization. So that's the direction we think we need to go.
We've got another email question here. It comes from Daniel, and everyone else who's watching can jump into the conversation by email, live at Duke, by Twitter, Duke Live, or on the Duke University Facebook page. So Daniel's getting to this tension here. Law enforcement and Muslim American community says, is it possible to avoid anti-Islamic procedures without affecting Homeland Security? He may be getting at sort of not giving offense in Muslim culture when law enforcement or others in the government are interacting with a Muslim American community.
Well, I mentioned that I said that the project of outreach between the FBI and Muslim Americans was partially successful. And what we've seen, I think, really in the last 3 years, but it kind of reached a climax maybe in 2008, is the question of the use of informants going into, who might be Muslim informants, but infiltrating essentially religious communities, even meeting people and kind of soliciting them inside mosques, to join some sort of radical plot. And that issue has really distanced Muslim American organizations and individuals and made them quite angry. Some feel that individuals were almost instigated into taking actions that without the informant they might never have even thought of. I'm not saying that that's what's happened. I'm saying that's what the perception has been. So I think those things need to be dealt with great care. And I think the FBI, as a national agency, but also local law enforcement, has to really think long and hard about when it's appropriate. And I'm not saying it's never appropriate, but there needs to be a very clear policy, and there needs to be a discussion between law enforcement and Muslims, a clearing of the air, in a sense, on that issue, if we're going to try to make progress on the relationship in general, which I believe will lead to counterterrorism benefits down the road. So is it possible? Yes, but are we not at a good place right now? Yes, unfortunately, and I think we need to really put some concerted effort into those initiatives to make better progress.
In talking about assimilating Muslims into American culture, that's a big emphasis in your report, and even your colleague here, Janan Reed, has done research that says in a lot of ways Muslim Americans are all Americans in terms of socioeconomic status and demographics. But even in her research, you see that when it comes to foreign policy, there's a difference. I mean, America is at war in two predominantly Muslim cultures, and you quote in your report one of the attempted acts of terrorism, the man from New York, and he says that they're killing Muslim brothers and sisters abroad. I have to do my duty here. So it seems that there's, in some extent, a underlying tension that you can't just smooth over by eating bread together or by getting to know one another.
Well, that's definitely true, but I don't think disagreements in foreign policy are things that necessarily mean you. Lots of groups have disagreements with lots of parts of American policy, and that's what's great about America, is that we can have those disagreements and we can talk about them in a free and open society. We can have a political system that is open to influence from all people, and that's an important part of what goes on. And so, yeah, sure, they have disagreements about foreign policy. I don't think that necessarily has to lead to acts of terrorism. It's interesting that you point that out, because a lot of our data of the 139 people, over 2/3 of them, the plots or the activities that they were engaged in that led to them committing crimes were actually directed abroad. In the sense they were interested in joining the jihad abroad, the defense against what they saw as Western or U.S. encroachment on Muslim territory, not necessarily doing something bad inside America. I think that's very interesting. But we do have to try to address that, and I'm not saying we should radically change U.S. foreign policy, but I think that President Obama's speech in Cairo earlier this year, I think was quite a brilliant speech, frankly, and it is the direction that we need to go, which is engagement, a sense of mutual respect with the Muslim world, specific initiatives that we need to make progress on. Clearly, trying to do something about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is an important thing for American Muslims and Muslims around the world. We abandoned, in a sense, our position as honest broker for a while in the post-9/11 period. We haven't really made any progress since President Obama has come in. Matter of fact, some think that the peace process is at a low ebb. We'll see if we can make progress there. But I think engaging on this full range of issues and having that kind of open dialogue and doing outreach are the things we need to do to talk about and try to address through peaceful democratic means the disagreements we have on foreign policy. And that's a very long-term project, but we have to do it.
Good. We've got 40 people participating in the office hours now, and we've got an email here that comes from Joe, who apparently on the internet has found some accusations about terrorist activity within the U.S. I don't think we're going to be able to get to the bottom of that particular situation, but what about from the perspective of an ordinary citizen who has a concern, sees something suspicious? What do you do? How does that work?
Well, I think if anybody sees something that upsets them and is suspicious, they should report it to the appropriate authorities. I don't think we should feel shamed or think that we're being discriminatory if you see something and you're worried about it, to report it. I would encourage people to not assume that every Muslim they see is a potential terrorist. That's not the way to go. But we need to be vigilant. You never know. And the I think we can trust that the authorities understand that this is both an important problem, but also one that needs to be dealt with sensitively. And local or higher levels of law enforcement will make an inquiry and take the appropriate action.
So talking about on the personal level, what about yourself in terms of why you study this area? I mean, in a way, terrorism is a grim subject to be focused on. So why do you spend your time on it?
Well, I think I was working as a kind of a normal Washington staff person working in the United States Senate on 9/11. And like everyone else, we were watching the horror of the Twin Towers. And then the next plane then hit the Pentagon. Somebody shouted, "Hey, they're after us. They're here in Washington too." And literally, we ran out the building, thinking that the office building that we were in could be the next target. It was really that level of immediate fear. And I remember vividly. The next day, drafting, working on the senator that I was working for speech to kind of talk about this conflict and what had happened. And I think people who weren't in Washington or New York just can't grasp how emotional and fearful that time was. My children were at 3 different daycare centers at the Smithsonian Institution on the Mall. And I would have to drop them off at 3 different places. And so I was getting the trunk of my car searched every day at those 3 different places. And then when I pulled into my parking space at my office. Then 1 month and 4 days after 9/11, we had the anthrax attacks that hit the United States Senate. And the envelope with the white powder was opened up in Senator Daschle's office, was the same floor that my office was on. And as a matter of fact, our chief of staff that day was working in Missouri, And so I was the lead person in charge of our office, and everyone there was, of course, very fearful that maybe they had contracted anthrax. The next day you came to work and there was a big line coming out of the infirmary that was 200 people long of people getting the nasal swabs to see if there were traces of anthrax in their system and getting doses of antibiotics in case they were. Later that day, we were told that traces of anthrax had been found in different portions of the air duct system in the building. And they told that we were going to ventilate and do more tests over the weekend. So we all took the day off on Friday, and then we came on Monday. They announced that the building would be closed indefinitely, and we were then scattered to the four winds to try to create an office in which we could actually do our work in. And we were out of that building for 3 months, and it had to be cleansed with some sort of ammonium hydroxide mixture to kill the anthrax in a huge office building. Then after that, I was involved for the next year, really, in a series of all of the reactions, the legislative reactions to 9/11 that took place. So the authorization for use of military force against al-Qaeda that led to the Afghan war, the U.S. Patriot Act, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, border enforcement, new border enforcement laws, a whole full range. And then we had, of course, the debate on the war in Iraq. So it really, in a way, kind of changed my intellectual framework about what was happening and what I was interested in.
What was that change from what to what?
Well, I guess I was interested in foreign policy and security, but not in as intense of a way that I had been before. And in some ways, when we started talking about Homeland Security, it was a new field. Now, the senator I was working for lost in the 2002 election, in a large part due to claims about security issues, false claims I thought, but claims nonetheless. And so I was left with trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my career in the late winter, early spring of 2003. And the place that I ended up was creating, together with Republican colleagues, the first congressional committee focused exclusively on Homeland Security that had been created in the United States Congress after the creation of the Department of Homeland Security in the early part of 2003. And I spent the next 2 years essentially creating this committee and helping to do oversight on this new fledgling agency and this new whole discipline of Homeland Security. And also, frankly, we were one of the core Democratic groups. I was on a partisan staff that was trying to create what is the Democrats' position on this conflict. How do we think this conflict should be dealt with? What are the security measures we think should be put in place? So that was a very challenging and interesting exercise, and I decided to kind of follow that experience and interest through to today.
Now, in talking about the stakes of this, I mean, we've been talking fairly abstractly about the policy of Homeland Security, but of course we know that recently CIA agents were killed in the field. People have their lives on the line when they do this. So when you're doing your work, when you're sitting at a laptop, how do you balance that with the fact that there's people in the armed forces and diplomatic corps that are risking their lives for the kinds of policies that are being determined in Washington?
Well, first, I think you have a great duty as somebody who's making policy to do it wisely because people's lives are at stake, whether it be the lives of Americans who are serving their country or the lives of civilians living in these countries. I mean, I happen to believe that the United States is a force for good and is trying to make the world a better place for Muslims, non-Muslims, people living in Afghanistan, and elsewhere. So, I support dealing with this conflict, trying to deal with it in a rational way. So I think it's an important thing to be involved in. It makes me feel like I'm doing important work, but it also creates an obligation to try to be as wise as possible about it. The second thing I think it makes you feel is that just to take care when you're being very critical, and that's an obligation of anybody to do when they see something to criticize, but to take care to understand how difficult these challenges are. For example, with the intelligence failures, yes, I think there were intelligence failures, but I think if you are not looking backwards on the clues that were missed, but you're looking forwards and looking at hundreds of thousands of tidbits of information, a world with billions of people, multiple conflicts that are very complex, that go to not only national and subnational, but tribal, maybe even neighborhood, or down to individual families. When you're trying to look at the mosaic of information that is out there to try to pick out the very few people who are going to try to get aboard an airliner and bring it down is an immense challenge. So, we have to take care, and the people, as you said, are losing their lives to try to give us better information to prevent these things from happening. So I think we have an obligation to them to understand and tell Americans that they're working very hard, that these are immensely difficult challenges, and we have to work together in a spirit of cooperation to try to get the job done and deal with this conflict the best we can.
Can I pick up on, you mentioned your role is the Democratic Staff Director of the House Select Committee on Homeland Security up through 2005. I still see polls to this day that say that the Democrats are the ones soft on terrorism. Obviously, you worked very much to counter that factually and in terms of impression. So what's your response to the public when you see those poll numbers?
Well, I think Democrats as a party did make progress on that. You don't win a presidential election unless the country feels that your nominee and the party that a nominee represents is going to keep them safe. Security is a threshold issue, and getting tough and using military force is often necessary, but it has to be used prudently. And I think Americans began to understand that this conflict is more complex than just saying if we get tough on the terrorists, then all of our solutions will be, our problems will all be solved. And I think President Obama did a good job during the campaign of articulating not a soft position, but a comprehensive, smart and tough and smart at the same time that Americans grasped onto. But of course now we're seeing some incidents. The administration's being tested, and we'll see. It's very important that we respond to these incidents, well, as a nation, first of all, putting aside the politics of it, effectively, and that President Obama is seen as a strong and effective leader. If we have more incidents, and if we have, and hopefully we never will, but successful incidents, that's going to be a very big political problem for President Obama and for Democrats.
What about this specific charge that actually your colleague Peter Fever has made, along with others, that the Obama administration has too much of a law enforcement mentality when it comes to counterterrorism? Even though Professor Obama said in his speech yesterday, we're at war against Al-Qaeda, but this sense that the Obama administration's framing counterterrorism as a police action and that's not tough enough. Is there substance to that? Is that a good move?
I think that kind of talk is really silliness. The Obama administration, by and large, with very small changes on the margins, is using the security infrastructure and intelligence infrastructure that was put in place by the Bush administration. Domestically, it's dealing with issues the exact same way, trying to prevent instances before they occur. And of course, many things have been preempted. The Zazi, the person who was compiling beauty salon materials to try to make a bomb in Colorado and then who traveled to New York, he was caught. The North Carolina people were caught and preempted. I don't really think Obama himself had anything to do with that. After all, it's the same FBI director that it was working for Obama as was working for Bush. John Brennan, the head of counterterrorism, was leading the National Counterterrorism Center in the Bush administration, the Obama administration. Bob Gates, the Secretary of Defense, none of those people would be working for President Obama if he thought that he had, come up with some fanciful, soft approach that wasn't going to be effective. So, yes, there's some policy disagreements on Guantanamo and whether Khalid Sheikh Mohammed should be tried in New York or in Guantanamo, but I think those are really issues on the margin. I think for the most part we've seen really a lot of continuity, but it's a dynamic threat, which means it's constantly changing, and therefore we have to adapt with those changes that the enemy is making, and as the President said yesterday, try to keep one step ahead of them. And so the test for the Obama administration will really be whether you can take the framework that was put in place by the prior administration and build on it in ways that are going to match and defeat the changes in the threat that we're seeing.
Okay. Professor Schanzer, if you get time for one more question, we just got one more email
Absolutely.
came in. Okay, here it goes from Mark, and he says, why aren't we seeing the American Muslim community uniting together to denounce terrorism, for example, through a well-publicized Washington march, thereby sending a strong message to radical Muslims in the world?
Well, I think that's a great idea. One of the things we looked at in our report was public statements against terrorism made by Muslim American individuals and organizations. And we really found that comprehensively these organizations were denouncing terrorism consistently every time it happened. Oftentimes those statements are not picked up by the media. We encourage the media to do that because it's an important part of the story. And that's a frequently heard criticism. We don't hear their voices. So yes, I would encourage Muslim Americans to do more in that regard. They should be outspoken and individuals, but sometimes it's not easy to break through the message and get your voice heard on the media. It's not as easy as maybe Mark would have it seem. But more public demonstrations that did get media attention, gosh, I think that's a great idea, and maybe some of the lead Muslim organizations should think about that.
We've covered a lot of ground here at your office hours. You've taken a lot of questions. Any concluding thoughts about Homeland Security, terrorism? What people should be paying attention to when we turn on the news tonight? What should we be listening for?
Well, so much is going on. I think the first thing is to try to separate the wheat from the chaff, and that it is unfortunately a highly politicized issue. And I encourage people to try to think about the complexities of this conflict and not be drawn into the sniping back and forth, and try to figure out what is the big picture, what are our goals, and what are the different ways that we can try to achieve them. And that, as I said before, is you have to have an offensive strategy. We need to deal with ungoverned places. We have a very serious conflict in Afghanistan, very complex, no easy answers. Homeland Security, trying to, of the millions of people coming in and out of the country on a daily, weekly basis, to try to find small substances like 80 grams of powder that's an explosive. Think about how hard that is. So I would encourage people to, try to focus on the big picture, not get too caught up in the political dialogue, and try to think about ways that we as a nation can work together and come up with the best ways to deal with this conflict.
Great. Well, Professor Schanzer, thank you for holding these online office hours.
Happy to do it.
All right. So to continue following the work of Professor Schanzer, you can poke around on the Duke Sanford School website at sanford.duke.edu. If you come back to the Duke Ustream channel on Sunday, 7 p.m., you can watch the keynote address of the Duke Winter Forum on making the green economy work. To learn more about Duke, visit duke.edu.